Relax, gentlemen, the billionaire CEO said with a thin smile, tapping the thick contract on the polished table. Our waitress here probably doesn't even understand English, let alone Japanese. A few quiet chuckles circled the private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel in Manhattan, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a skyline, glowing in late evening gold. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm lights, silverware rested on linen as white as fresh snow, and around the table sat a group of executives discussing a deal worth $500 million. At the center of it all was Daniel Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, a man whose net worth had been estimated somewhere north of $4 billion, a man used to rooms going silent when he spoke. Across from him sat three Japanese investors in tailored suits, their expressions careful and polite as Whitmore leaned back in his chair and continued translating the final clause of a thick legal document printed in both English and Japanese. Standing quietly a few steps behind them was Naomi Carter, a 26-year-old black waitress holding a polished silver tray with two untouched glasses of sparkling water. Her uniform was simple, black vest, white shirt, sensible shoes made for 10-hour shifts, the kind that left your feet aching by the end of the night. To most people in that room, Naomi was invisible, just another server moving silently between wealthy guests, another background figure in a building where the cheapest dinner cost more than her weekly grocery bill. But while the men at the table nodded along to Whitmore's confident translation, Naomi's eyes moved slowly across the open page in front of him. She wasn't trying to listen, not at first. She had simply glanced down when she stepped forward to refill a glass. Yet the moment her eyes caught a line of Japanese text, something in her expression changed. The words Whitmore was speaking did not match the words printed on the page. Not even close. Naomi froze for half a second, the quiet clink of ice settling in a glass the only sound near her tray. Around the table the conversation continued smoothly, confident, expensive, certain. Whitmore spoke as if the room belonged to him, explaining how the clause simply confirmed shared intellectual property rights between both companies. The Japanese investors nodded politely, though one of them, Kenji Takahashi, leaned slightly closer to the document, as if something felt just a little off. Naomi felt her pulse quicken, because the sentence in front of her did not say shared rights. Not even remotely. The original Japanese wording described a complete transfer of proprietary technology once the contract was signed. In plain terms, if the investors agreed to Whitmore's translation, they would unknowingly give up ownership of an invention worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Naomi looked down again, rereading the line carefully. The characters were clear, precise. There was no misunderstanding. What Whitmore had just told the room was completely different from what the document actually said. For a moment she considered stepping back, saying nothing, letting the deal move forward like every other powerful conversation that passed through this room, without a single server ever being noticed. After all, she was just the waitress. But then Whitmore laughed softly and added one more confident line of translation, a sentence that twisted the clause even further. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. The investors nodded again. Pens began to slide across the polished table, ready for signatures. And that was the moment Naomi Carter quietly spoke four words that made the entire room stop breathing. That's not what it says. For a moment the entire room stopped moving as if the air itself had been switched off. The soft jazz drifting through the restaurant downstairs faded into the background, while every eye slowly turned toward the young woman standing beside the table. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not move the tray in her hands. She simply stood there with the calm stillness of someone who had already double-checked what she knew to be true. Daniel Whitmore blinked once, clearly surprised that the silence in the room had been broken by someone he had not even considered part of the conversation. His expression shifted from mild confusion to thin irritation, the kind powerful men wore when something small interrupted a very expensive moment. "Excuse me," he said slowly, leaning back in his chair as if giving the room time to laugh again. But no one laughed this time. Naomi lowered the tray carefully onto a nearby service stand, her movements measured and quiet. "The clause you just translated," she said politely, her voice steady. "That is not what the Japanese text actually says. The words floated across the polished table like a glass placed too gently on marble. Kenji Takahashi's head turned toward her instantly. The older investor had been watching the contract closely, and now his brows drew together with sharp attention. Daniel Whitmore gave a short breath that sounded almost like a chuckle. "That is quite a claim," he replied, smoothing the sleeve of his tailored navy jacket. "And I assume you are fluent in Japanese legal terminology now." A few faint smiles appeared around the table, the kind that suggested the room expected this small interruption to end quickly. Naomi did not react to the tone. Instead, she stepped half a pace closer to the table, her eyes resting on the page in front of Whitmore. Then, in clear and confident Japanese, she read the exact sentence printed in the contract. The sound of the language landed in the room with quiet precision, every syllable crisp, every character pronounced with the rhythm of someone who had spoken it for years. The reaction was immediate. Kenji Takahashi straightened in his chair so quickly that the leather creaked beneath him. One of the other investors lifted his hand from the table and looked directly at the document again as Naomi calmly continued the translation in English. "The clause states that upon signature, the proprietary design rights transfer fully to Whitmore Dynamics under exclusive ownership," she explained gently. "It does not describe shared intellectual property." A silence heavier than the first one filled the room. Daniel Whitmore's confident posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The investors exchanged glances that carried the kind of careful calculation people used when hundreds of millions of dollars were suddenly involved. Naomi did not speak again immediately. She simply waited beside the table, the same quiet waitress who had entered the room carrying glasses of water 10 minutes earlier. But something had changed, because now every person sitting at that polished table was looking at her, as if she had just stepped out from behind a curtain no one realized had been there at all. Kenji Takahashi slowly slid the contract closer to himself and read the line again in silence. His finger paused over the exact characters Naomi had spoken aloud. And then he looked up directly at Daniel Whitmore with an expression that was no longer polite. Kenji Takahashi did not speak right away. He read the line again slowly, his finger resting beneath the exact characters Naomi had spoken, as if measuring every stroke of ink. The quiet in the room grew heavier with each second. One of the other investors leaned closer, adjusting his glasses while the soft hum of the city outside pressed against the windows 42 floors above Manhattan. Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat gently, the smooth confidence returning to his voice like a practiced performance. "I believe there may be a misunderstanding," he said, folding his hands on the table as if the moment required nothing more than a small clarification. Japanese legal language can be extremely nuanced. Naomi remained standing beside the service stand, her posture straight but calm, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the tray. She did not interrupt him. She simply waited. Whitmore gave a polite smile toward the investors. "The clause describes a cooperative framework for technology integration," he continued smoothly. "Shared operational authority. That is the intended meaning." Kenji Takahashi looked at him for a long moment without responding. Then he slowly turned his eyes back toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, pronouncing her name with deliberate clarity. "Would you repeat the original sentence again in Japanese?" Naomi nodded once. Her voice was quiet, but when she spoke the language flowed with precise rhythm, every syllable measured, every tone balanced with the calm certainty of someone who had studied it long before stepping into this room, carrying a tray of water glasses. When she finished, she translated the line again into English, word for word, explaining the structure of the clause and how the ownership terms shifted completely once the contract was signed. One of the younger executives at the table leaned forward quickly and flipped 2 pages deeper into the document as if searching for confirmation. Another investor pulled out his phone and opened a translation program, typing carefully while the silence thickened again. The glow from the screen reflected across his glasses as he read the result. His expression changed first. Not dramatically, just a subtle tightening around the mouth, the small physical signal that something no longer fit together the way it had 5 minutes earlier. Kenji Takahashi looked down at the contract once more and then placed both hands flat against the polished table. "Mr. Whitmore," he said slowly, "this wording appears very specific." "Daniel." Whitmore's smile remained in place, but the ease behind it had faded slightly. Contracts often appear rigid before interpretation, he replied, leaning forward now. Our legal team prepared the English translation carefully. Naomi spoke again before the room could drift back toward Whitmore's explanation. The English version on the next page uses different language, she said gently. That is where the meaning changes. Kenji Takahashi turned the page. The paper slid softly across the table. His eyes moved across the English paragraph, while the other investors leaned closer beside him. A long breath passed through the room. Outside the windows, the Manhattan skyline shimmered under evening lights, traffic moving like rivers of red and white across distant avenues. Inside the room, the quiet waitress who had entered unnoticed 10 minutes earlier had become the center of every gaze. And for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel Whitmore was no longer the one controlling the conversation. Kenji Takahashi read the English paragraph slowly, his eyes moving from left to right as the quiet tension in the room deepened. The words were clear enough on the surface, but the difference between the two versions of the clause now hung in the air like a shadow stretching across the polished table. One described shared technological development. The other described complete transfer of ownership once the agreement was finalized. It was not a small distinction. It was the difference between partnership and surrender. Takahashi lifted his head and looked directly at Daniel Whitmore again. The politeness in his expression had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. Mr. Whitmore, he said calmly, the English text and the Japanese text do not appear identical. Around the table, the other investors leaned in closer, their chairs shifting slightly across the floor. One of them turned the contract sideways so the pages aligned beside each other, comparing the clauses line by line. Daniel Whitmore's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, the confident stillness of his posture now working harder to hold the room together. Translations can vary in tone, he replied smoothly. The legal intention remains cooperative. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the service stand, her eyes steady but respectful. She had not moved from her position, yet the quiet gravity of the room now seemed to orbit around her presence. Kenji Takahashi looked down again at the Japanese text, and then back at the English version. Cooperative meaning shared ownership, he said slowly. Yes. Whitmore gave a measured nod. Exactly. Takahashi then turned his attention back toward Naomi. Miss Carter, he said gently. In the Japanese clause you read earlier, is the ownership described as shared? Naomi paused only briefly before answering. No, she said calmly. The wording indicates a full transfer of proprietary design rights to Whitmore Dynamics after the contract is signed. The air in the room shifted again. One of the investors quietly placed his pen down on the table, the faint tap echoing far louder than it should have in the silence. Another executive leaned back slightly, folding his arms as if reconsidering the entire conversation that had taken place over the last hour. Daniel Whitmore let out a soft breath and leaned forward, resting his forearms against the table now. With respect, he said carefully, Miss Carter is not part of the legal review team. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the open page again, her eyes resting on the exact sentence that had started the shift in the room. The phrase used is dokusen teki shoyu, she said quietly. That means exclusive ownership. The Japanese investors exchanged glances that required no translation at all. Kenji Takahashi slowly closed the contract halfway and sat back in his chair, studying Daniel Whitmore with a thoughtful expression that was far less accommodating than before. Outside the tall windows, the evening lights of Manhattan flickered like distant stars, but inside the private dining room something far more delicate was happening. A conversation that had begun with confidence and certainty was now balancing on a thin line of doubt. And the person who had introduced that doubt was still standing beside the table in a black server uniform. The quiet waitress who had only intended to refill a glass of water before noticing a single line of text that did not say what the room believed it said. The silence that followed Naomi's explanation stretched across the table like a tightening wire. Kenji Takahashi rested his fingers on the closed edge of the contract, tapping it once very lightly, as if confirming the weight of what had just been said. Daniel Whitmore watched him carefully now, the polished confidence that had filled the room earlier still present, but no longer effortless. Mr. Takahashi, Whitmore said calmly, the intent of the agreement has always been collaboration. If the language appears stronger in one version, that is simply the nature of translation. Takahashi did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the contract again and slid the document toward one of his associates. The man adjusted his glasses and read the Japanese clause quietly to himself, his lips moving almost invisibly as he traced the characters line by line. Naomi Carter remained beside the service stand, her presence calm and steady, but inside her chest, she could feel her heartbeat slowly accelerating. She had not planned to speak tonight. Her shift had started like any other evening at the Grand Meridian, greeting guests, carrying trays, moving silently through conversations that belonged to people far wealthier than she would likely ever become. Yet one glance at that single sentence had changed the direction of the entire room. The associate finished reading and leaned closer to Takahashi, whispering a few quiet words in Japanese. The older investor listened without moving, then gave a slow nod. Around the table, the atmosphere shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Chairs creaked slightly as people adjusted their posture. One of the American executives from Whitmore Dynamics glanced toward Naomi and then quickly away again, as if realizing that the quiet waitress had just become the most important voice in the room. Daniel Whitmore clasped his hands together, his smile returning with controlled patience. "If there is any confusion," he said, "our legal department can clarify the translation immediately." Kenji Takahashi lifted his eyes toward him. "Yes," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "Clarification would be wise." Then he turned back toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said, "may I ask you something?" Naomi nodded politely. "Where did you learn Japanese?" The question lingered in the air for a moment, and several people at the table leaned back slightly, as if the meeting had taken an unexpected turn. Naomi hesitated only briefly before answering. "My mother was a language teacher," she said. "She taught Japanese at a public high school in Queens for almost 20 years. The room grew a little quieter as she continued. "When I was young, she used to practice lessons at the kitchen table. I learned by listening." Takahashi studied her face with new interest. "You studied formally as well?" Naomi gave a small nod. 2 years of language and translation courses at City College before I had to start working full-time. Daniel Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, the rhythm of the meeting no longer moving under his control. The investors were no longer focused on the deal itself. Their attention had turned to the woman standing beside the table. Kenji Takahashi looked down at the contract again, then back toward Naomi, and in that quiet exchange something unspoken passed through the room. Because the more carefully they considered the clause, the clearer one possibility began to rise above all the others. The translation Naomi had spoken might not simply be a mistake that someone overlooked. It might reveal something far more deliberate hiding inside a contract worth $500 million. Kenji Takahashi leaned back slowly in his chair, the contract still open in front of him, his eyes moving between the Japanese text and the English translation as if the 2 pages belonged to completely different agreements. The quiet tension in the private dining room had now turned into something heavier, something that no amount of polite conversation could smooth over. Daniel Whitmore remained composed on the surface, but the small shifts in his posture revealed the pressure building beneath the calm exterior. His fingers tapped once against the table before he stopped himself, folding his hands again as though control could still be restored with the right explanation. "This appears to be an issue of interpretation," Whitmore said evenly. "Language differences can easily create confusion in complex agreements." But the words did not carry the same authority they had earlier in the evening. Kenji Takahashi studied him carefully for a long moment before speaking again. "Interpretation usually does not change ownership," he replied quietly. The statement was not loud, yet it landed in the room with the weight of something undeniable. One of the investors beside him slid the contract toward the center of the table again, pointing at the line Naomi had translated earlier. Another man opened a laptop, quickly typing while a legal translation database loaded across the screen. The glow from the monitor reflected across the polished surface of the table as he compared the phrasing with standard legal definitions used in international technology agreements. Naomi Carter stood quietly where she had been since the conversation shifted, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the service stand. She had said what she believed to be true, and now the room was slowly catching up to the implications of it. Across the table, the investor working on the laptop paused and looked up. The phrase does translate as exclusive ownership, he said carefully, turning the screen so the others could see. Kenji Takahashi nodded once, his expression now thoughtful rather than polite. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly, studying the screen, and for the first time since the meeting began his confident smile did not immediately return. Instead he gave a small breath through his nose, as though calculating his next move. If the wording appears too rigid, he said after a moment, we can amend the clause before signing. That is not unusual in negotiations. The explanation might have worked earlier, before Naomi spoke, before the room began examining the document with fresh attention. But now every person at the table understood that the clause had been presented as already agreed upon. The investors exchanged quiet looks that carried more meaning than words. Kenji Takahashi slowly closed the laptop in front of him and placed both hands on the table again. Mr. Whitmore, he said calmly, this clause was introduced as finalized language. Yet the English translation suggests something very different from the Japanese text. The room fell silent again. Outside the tall glass windows, the lights of New York City stretched endlessly across the night, taxis moving like distant ribbons of gold through the streets far below. Inside the private dining room, the conversation had reached a point where one truth was beginning to surface clearly above the rest. The contract that had been meant to seal a $500 million partnership was now raising a question far more serious than simple translation. And the quiet waitress standing beside the table had just become the person who forced everyone in the room to ask it. Daniel Whitmore did not answer Kenji Takahashi right away. For the first time that evening, the billionaire leaned back in his chair and looked down at the contract instead of the people around the table. The quiet confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations now seemed to weigh differently in the room. Across from him, the investors watched carefully, their earlier politeness replaced by a sharper focus. Kenji Takahashi spoke again, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Whitmore, a difference in language can be corrected, but a difference in ownership is not a small detail. The words settled heavily across the polished table. One of the other investors slowly closed his notebook, the faint sound echoing in the silence like a signal that the meeting had entered an entirely new phase. Naomi Carter remained beside the service stand, still wearing the same black vest and white shirt she had walked in with earlier that evening. Yet the way the room regarded her had changed completely. 10 minutes ago, she had been invisible. Now every person at the table understood that a single sentence she spoke had shifted the balance of a $500 million agreement. Daniel Whitmore finally lifted his eyes again. Let us not exaggerate the situation, he said carefully. This is precisely why negotiations exist. We review, we adjust, and we finalize. Kenji Takahashi studied him for a long moment before replying. We review before presenting final terms, he said. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable. Another investor reached for the contract again and flipped several pages backward, examining earlier clauses that had already been discussed. The quiet sound of paper turning filled the space while the city lights outside continued to glow against the dark glass windows. The investor stopped on another section and glanced at Naomi briefly before returning to the page. If this clause was translated differently, he said slowly, we must confirm the rest as well. Daniel Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his tone remained composed. Our legal team prepared the document through standard channels, he replied. There is no reason to assume broader issues. Kenji Takahashi leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table again. Perhaps, he said, but trust in international agreements is built on precision. The room fell quiet once more. Naomi could feel the weight of their attention, yet she did not step back or apologize for speaking earlier. Instead, she simply remained still, aware that the conversation unfolding now was no longer about a waitress interrupting a meeting. It had become about whether the most powerful man in the room had presented a contract that did not say what he claimed it said. One of the investors glanced toward the laptop again and then back to the document in front of him. His brow tightened slightly as he reread another section. A few seconds passed before he spoke. Mr. Takahashi, he said quietly, this paragraph here also uses the same phrasing. Kenji Takahashi turned his head toward the page. Naomi's eyes followed instinctively, and the moment she saw the line her expression shifted again. because the wording in that paragraph carried the same legal structure she had noticed before. Another clause. Another transfer of control hidden behind careful translation. And suddenly the contract that had once appeared perfectly balanced no longer looked like a partnership at all. The moment Naomi's eyes landed on the new clause, she felt the same quiet certainty she had felt minutes earlier. The phrasing was nearly identical. Different sentence structure, same legal outcome. Exclusive control hidden behind softer English wording. Across the table, the investor who had found the paragraph slid the contract slightly toward Kenji Takahashi so he could read it himself. Takahashi adjusted the page beneath the warm light above the table, his eyes moving slowly across the Japanese text. The room remained perfectly still except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of traffic drifting up from the streets of Manhattan far below. Daniel Whitmore watched the investors carefully now, his posture controlled, though the easy confidence that had filled the beginning of the meeting had faded into something more guarded. Kenji Takahashi read the clause once in silence, then again more slowly. After a few seconds he looked up. This sentence also contains the phrase Dokusen Teki Shoyu, he said quietly. One of the other investors nodded immediately, confirming what he had seen. The translation on the English page beside it described strategic coordination between both companies. But the Japanese wording again suggested a far more one-sided outcome. Naomi Carter felt every pair of eyes briefly move toward her again, as if the room now expected her to confirm what they were beginning to suspect. She stepped slightly closer to the table, careful not to touch the contract itself. The structure is the same, she said calmly. It means the technology developed after the agreement would belong solely to Whitmore Dynamics. A quiet breath passed through the group of investors, the kind of sound people make when a realization settles in place piece by piece. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. That interpretation assumes the most rigid reading possible, he said, his voice still measured. Legal language often appears stronger in its original form. Kenji Takahashi listened without interrupting, then slowly turned another page. The paper made a soft sliding sound across the table. How many clauses contain this phrasing? He asked, more to the document than to anyone in the room. The younger investor beside him began scanning the pages carefully, his finger tracing down the columns of text. Naomi watched quietly from where she stood. For several seconds nothing was said. Then the investor stopped on another paragraph and tapped the line once with the tip of his pen. Here as well, he said quietly. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It carried the shape of a pattern. 3 clauses now. Each one described in English as cooperative development. Each one written in Japanese as exclusive ownership once the agreement took effect. Kenji Takahashi closed the contract halfway and leaned back in his chair again, his expression calm, but far more serious than when the evening had begun. Mr. Whitmore, he said slowly, if these clauses are accurate, then the agreement we are reviewing tonight does not describe a partnership. Daniel Whitmore's gaze remained steady, but the atmosphere around the table had already changed beyond repair. Because everyone in the room now understood the same thing. What had first appeared to be a simple translation mistake had revealed something much larger, hiding inside the contract. And the quiet waitress who had noticed the first sentence was now the reason a $500 million deal had come to a complete and unexpected stop. For several seconds after Kenji Takahashi spoke, no one in the private dining room moved. The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict. The agreement we are reviewing tonight does not describe a partnership. Daniel Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his hands folded together as he looked across the pages that had once seemed so carefully arranged. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind him through the tall glass windows, thousands of lights blinking across the night like distant signals. Earlier that evening those lights had framed a celebration waiting to happen, a $500 million alliance between a rising American technology company and one of Japan's most respected investment groups. Now the same view seemed to witness something entirely different. Kenji Takahashi slowly closed the contract and rested his palm on the cover. The gesture was quiet, but the meaning was unmistakable. Mr. Whitmore, he said calmly. The language here transfers ownership of our technology, our future research, and any development produced under this agreement. He paused briefly, letting the weight of that statement settle. That is not cooperation. Around the table, the other investors exchanged careful glances, each of them now looking at the document with the same realization forming in their minds. What had begun as a negotiation had quietly revealed the outline of something else entirely. Daniel Whitmore exhaled slowly, as if calculating whether any explanation could restore the confidence that had slipped away during the last 20 minutes. If the wording has created concern, he said finally, we can revisit the structure of the agreement. But Kenji Takahashi gently shook his head. The concern is not wording, he replied. The concern is intention. The silence that followed was deeper than any pause earlier in the meeting. One of the investors reached forward and gathered the loose pages together, aligning them carefully before sliding the contract toward the center of the table. No signatures had been placed. No deal had been finalized. And now it was clear that none would be tonight. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, the authority he had carried into the room now resting on uncertain ground. Across the table, Kenji Takahashi turned his head toward Naomi Carter. The young waitress still stood beside the service stand where she had been when this entire moment began, her black vest and white shirt unchanged, the quiet tray beside her holding 2 untouched glasses of water. Takahashi studied her for a moment before speaking. Miss Carter, he said gently, if you had not spoken earlier, we might have signed this agreement tonight. Naomi did not step forward or look proud. She simply nodded once, her voice calm. I only read what was written. The answer lingered in the room with a quiet clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful truth is not discovered by those who expect to control the outcome. Sometimes it is noticed by the one person no one thought was paying attention at all. And as the investors slowly gathered their documents and prepared to leave the table, one fact had become impossible to ignore. The most important voice in a $500 million negotiation had not belonged to the billionaire at the head of the table. It had belonged to the quiet waitress who understood exactly what the contract really said.